It's fun, it's restful. You get a break. We all need a break for sure. For sure. All right. It's good to see a couple of faces. Yay. Very nice. All right. Um, I haven't put in an announcement about due dates. I think we talked about these things before. I think this is the class where I can't remember, but I'll go back and check, where we may have changed an official due date on the uh, last weekly question, so you don't necessarily have to turn it in on Friday. I'd prefer you got the quiz done by Friday if you can. And if you have any issues with any of the due dates, feel free to send me an email. The goal really is to get caught up over spring break. Because at some point we have to be caught up. Spring break would be a good point for that. Also, it's possible you might start to work on your book review over spring break. For your class, oh gosh, this is always yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this book lately, and it just may not be a good fit anymore. But I often suggest to you that book, Black Like Me, not because it's necessarily the greatest book ever. There's certainly other books you could read that are probably much more authentic about the civil rights era. But I typically suggested that to people because it's easy to read. I'm not going to lie. But there are other things that you could read that might be more authentic discussions of the civil rights movement. This is about a reporter who was a white guy that went undercover as a black guy because people in general in the late 50s, early 60s didn't believe African American accounts of how they were mistreated. And lots of average African Americans would not, I mean, everyday folks would not discuss how they were treated, and white folks wouldn't talk about how they mistreated African Americans. So this guy just kind of got an urge as a reporter, and he thought it was kind of a religious thing as well. He had kind of a religious awakening. He'd been an atheist and then went blind and then got his sight back. So it's a weird story overall, but he produces this memoir of when he went undercover as a black guy and how he was treated. And he lived in the Dallas area, I think it was Mansfield, and ended up having to move out of the country because it was so poorly received. He got death threats and people made little dolls of him and hung them in effigy, that sort of stuff. Um, and it's an interesting perspective, but it's not an authentic perspective. I completely understand that. So I really have been kind of rethinking. It's like maybe, but there are other things on the book list that would be good. Um, I That's just short, to be honest. That's short. But you don't want to pick stuff necessarily because it's short. Anybody you want to read about any event in U.S. history that has to do, well, that happened after Reconstruction would be good. So if there's a person you want to read about, an event, um, I know sometimes for the more sporting people, I would suggest really a boxing book, but something called, oh crud, Ghosts of Manila. So it was about the Ali Frazier fights and how politics lined up with the Ali Frazier fights. Frazier was pro-Vietnam War. Ali was anti-Vietnam War, and it also brings in the Nation of Islam into the discussion. So it's kind of a complicated book about boxing, which is sort of interesting. And a lot of the stuff that I have on the book list is from a class that I took in college that I thought had interesting reading. You know, it was an, yeah. So, but you don't have to pick any of those books. You don't. Anything you're interested in is what you should read about. And there's lots of really modern stuff. It's, you know, stuff that's been written in the last 4 or 5 years that's not on that list that would be completely appropriate. So anything you're interested in that you can somehow talk about the thesis, whether the author proves the thesis, how it relates to things that are in the textbook, things you already knew, and something you could be critical of. And by critical, I don't mean negative about. I mean, you could be if you like, but by critical, I mean that you can have some comments like this was good, but this was bad. I appreciated this, but if the author had added that, it might have been better. When you're doing the part about the book where you're critical, I wouldn't necessarily say, and I suggested this to one of you in your weekly things, I wouldn't say like that was dumb or this is ignorant. I would describe it like this is what this person said and this is why I thought it was a problem. Um, and I've occasionally had students say like this is poorly written, but it's a book that got a Pulitzer Prize. So you may or may not want to say that, you know, especially if the book got the Pulitzer Prize. So if you have a question about a book, send me an email. And if it's not on the book list, which may not be, just get an approval. It's very rare that I'm going to say no to a book. The times that I say no to a book is if it's not written at least a high school level, or if it's not going to be easily discussed in historical context. Like every once in a while, I have people want to write about a novel or something like that, which you could do. However, if you did it, you really have to talk more about the setting than the characters. And that's typically why you read a novel. So, yeah, but, all right. I think that's all I have to say about the book review. I think that's it. All right. Did we talk about weekly question? Oh, let's see, did I? Oh, I know, I said I was going to open the right stuff. So let's see if I did. That looks promising. Okay, so weekly question for today, causes of the Great Depression. Be specific and detailed in the discussion. What absence of laws might have set the conditions. And then, oh yeah, New Deal. We're on the New Deal, aren't we? So this may be the one that you do over spring break. Identify the changes in American politics and society brought by the New Deal. Mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. Of course, if you're talking about this, you're going to pick a couple of laws. I would pick, and we'll talk about this as we go through the Civilian Conservation Corps. I would pick the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, and I would pick the NRA, National Recovery Act. The reason I would pick those three, you don't have to, I promise you don't have to, but the reason I would pick those three is the CCC is incredibly popular. So everybody likes it. And that's hardly ever happens in politics. The reason I would pick the AAA and the NRA is they're both declared unconstitutional. So there's typically a quiz question about those. So if you talk about those, it probably prepares you for the quiz a little bit as well. You should also consider talking about FDR because, you know, he's the guy that made the New Deal. And if you like, you could talk about critics of the New Deal. And the main ones are typically considered Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin and the doctor. Crud, why can't I think of the doctor's name? But why can't I think of it? Dang, Dr. We'll talk about him in a minute. He's in the notes, so we'll get to him. Crud, I hate it when that happens. All right. All right, okay. And just a reminder that your timed question review is in the course documents page. So if you'll look at the list of stuff here, that'll help you. Dang it, I just put in their major new critic. Doctor, why can't I think of his name? We're going to see it here in a second. And then I'm going to go like, dang, how could I have forgotten that? So here's your list of things to study for the quiz and should be helpful on the quiz. Should be, yep. All right, let's go to the notes. Let's go. Let's go. Woo. All right. Sorry for the quick scroll. If you're like me and you look at it too closely, it makes you sick to your stomach, so don't look at it. All right, here we go. So, New Deal. So we have the Great Depression. It starts in the late 1930s. It continues for a decade, which is why it's called great. It's not called great because we like it. It's called great because it lasts a really long time. And in the middle of that, there's a discussion of Keynesian economics. I believe we've talked about this before. Sorry for the stretch. John Maynard Keynes is a British economist, and the British economist fellow says the only way to get out of a depression is to spend your way out of it. The only entity that can afford to spend money when it doesn't have it is a government. So getting out of a depression, an economic crisis, is going to require government spending. It's a discussion we're still currently having in probably the next 15 minutes, your President Biden, our president. I always say your president because I started off today with your governor, my governor too. I don't know why I do that. Our governor, our president. I'm not opposed to either. Oh, crud. I can't think of names today. Governor Abbott or President Biden. I'm not opposed to them, realizing they're both in different parties and have different political philosophies. President Biden's going to sign a big stimulus bill today, and some people think maybe not enough. Some people think too much. Discussion that started, even during the era we're talking about. So, looking at the Hoover administration, and some of you are kind of currently writing how did the Hoover administration deal with the Great Depression, the end of question number 3 for this unit. He created some stuff. The Federal Home Loan Corporation, the Federal Farm Bureau created, we had highlighted some of the stuff, Smoot-Hawley tariff, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and a big public works project, the Hoover Dam. And this is more intervention than anyone had ever done in the economy on the national scale. Certainly no president had intervened like this before. However, it really didn't produce a marked change. Plus, they kept saying stupid stuff. I just sent an email saying, like, don't say he said stupid stuff, just quote him. But he kept saying things like, prosperity's just around the corner, soon we'll have a chicken in every pot. If we just keep staying the course, the economy will fix itself. And it seems like stupid stuff in retrospect, because I just said that, but the economy had always fixed itself before. Now, I will also mention to you, because a couple of you have sent your work ahead of time, mentioned some really ridiculously racist sounding stuff that was said during that time period about how you can hire people in certain parts of the country who are African American and pay them lower wages. And there's no way to get around that. That's racist. Yeah, no way. And we're not trying to get around that. But what I would like for you to think about, maybe not too much because you got other stuff to think about, is those quotes were said out loud in press conferences and put in newspapers. So the reason I think seeing quotes like that matters, even though they're offensive, which they clearly are, is it shows you that during that time period, those were mainstream ideas. That if your president is saying, and I know, we just had a president who occasionally said things that weren't mainstream ideas, but he was unusual. Just trust me on this historically. Or you don't have to trust me. You can go back and look. We occasionally have presidents who just say off the cuff things, but Trump is in his own category in a lot of ways, I think. But when Hoover's a really kind of prim and proper sort of fellow, but we have discussed many times that how progressivism is not progressive about race. And even though when we look back, we consider guys like Teddy Roosevelt to be more progressive about race than other folks. You guys have pointed out, from your reading, there are times that he's not very progressive at all. And he certainly feels the same way that most leaders during this time period feel, that people need to assimilate, that there should be a common American culture. And that's definitely a philosophy that is not as mainstream now as it was then. I'm not going to say no one thinks that way. People surely still do. Most younger people, I think, not so much. But, it also depends on what part of the country you're in and what you mean by assimilation. But I think most people I don't even want to say. I don't have any idea what most people think. I used to think I did, but now it's confusing to me. All right, let's go back to talking about Hoover. So you've got the list of stuff that Hoover did. It looks like a lot compared to what people have done in the past. However, if you compare it to what goes on in FDR's administration, it's not so much. And once you see what FDR does, it really doesn't compare. But FDR is groundbreaking in a lot of ways, which is part of the reason you have the question. So the weekly question asks in part, how is the New Deal, how does it change what people think is now the responsibility of the government? I know I didn't word it quite that way. You've studied history enough to know that up until this time, no one expected the government to fix the economy. People really thought the same way Hoover thought about the economy, that the economy would fix itself. However, the economy did not fix itself in this situation. So a discussion of Keynesian economics ensued. Hoover is much more conservative economically. It's like, no, we cannot spend ourselves into massive debt. FDR is more willing to do that. So now FDR is not going to go crazy either. And some people who are more Keynesian will go with that, who think the government could and should do more to intervene in the economy, will say that a failing of the New Deal is that it doesn't spend enough money to truly redistribute wealth. And it doesn't. The goal of the New Deal seems to be to jumpstart the economy and kind of get it going again. So, and I think there are going to be arguments about the current stimulus package, whether it's more like the New Deal to jumpstart the economy, or if it's really supposed to be a planned redistribution of assets. I think most people probably will land somewhere in the middle, but who honestly knows, right? Okay. So Hoover runs for president. The economy's terrible. Plus he sends out the military to shoot at the veterans. Dude's not nobody's going to vote. Yeah, he's not going to win. Although it's closer than you might expect, because, he's the middle of the country kind of guy, and there's still that rural urban split. And yeah, okay. Now, FDR, you're not going to see him as super liberal either by modern standards, but for the time period, he's a different kind of guy. He wants to speak directly to the American people. He wants to make pretty broad changes. He's going to be slightly more interested in race, although it's not going to be his main thing. His main things are going to be Great Depression and World War II. But people within his administration will focus more on race. And then after World War II, for a variety of reasons, which will make sense to you if they don't already, as we go through it, you'll see changes on race. The reason I'm talking about race so much is, as I was grading your work, almost all of your answers mention something about race, and it's disturbing to you, and I get it. It's disturbing to you that in this time period, people were not concerned about racial equality, and you're correct, they were not. And I'm not saying that very few people, that no one was, but on the national scale, neither political party really was, and the NAACP was, and you see individuals, our favorite person, probably Ida Wells Barnett, who's still doing her thing throughout the country. But it's a very slow process. And I don't know what else to say about that, except it's a very slow process. But I mention it because so many of the things that I graded over the last 2 days mention we are terrible about race during this time period. You are not kidding. We are terrible about race during this time period. Yep. Good observation, truth. Okay, I would not expect the New Deal. You don't expect the New Deal to be better about race, do you? It's going to be slightly better, but not much. And you're still going to look at it and go like, dang, they really don't get it yet. You're correct. Yeah. Yeah. And society is not ready to make changes, but they are ready after World War II with a big push. Yeah. All right. Other stuff. FDR is going to embrace Keynesian economics, and he's going to promise a New Deal. It's an analogy to a card game, a poker game, where he says, if you get a hand, it's a bad hand, you fold, and then you ask for a new deal, and then you can start over. So you don't quit, you don't leave the game. It's just a different round or a different hand. So he said, we'll keep the programs that work. If they don't work, we'll scrap them and try something else. So there are literally hundreds of New Deal organizations. So when you're studying for the quiz, I'm telling you CCC, NRA, AAA, and FDIC as well are probably things that you want to study. Townsend, Francis Townsend, that's the name of that doctor. Dang, I hate it when I forget stuff. All right. People were concerned that the New Deal might go too far, but FDR's plan is to kind of put it in the middle between Nazism, which is going too far to the right to restructure the economy, and Stalinism, socialism that goes too far to the left. According to FDR, all right, so his New Deal plans for relief, recovery, and reform. So relief's immediate stuff like you're hungry, so they give you food. Recovery is you lost your job, so they give you a job. The government creates some jobs, lots of public works jobs during this time period. And reform is we fix the system so this stuff never happens again. So we create the SEC, we create the FDIC, we create lots of banking laws, trade laws, stock regulations, that sort of stuff. Okay, so when FDR wins the presidency, which everyone knew it was not going to be Herbert Hoover. So all you had to be is not Hoover. So FDR is not Hoover, and he's also attractive in his own way. I don't mean like you look at a picture and go like, no, he's not. I mean politically. Maybe to Mrs. Roosevelt, although probably not. If you really wanted to read some weird stuff for your book review, maybe FDR's family. Dang. You know what I would read though? Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the book review. I know I'm not on topic, but you do need to do the book review. I think one of the most interesting folks I learned about who was crucial to the civil rights movement coming up is a guy named Bayard Rustin. And I'll type his name in and then I'm going back to the thing, I promise. Yeah. I didn't mention that FDR was paralyzed from the waist down because of polio. And they hid that during the time period, which I think is kind of interesting, but it's because they thought that it signified weakness. It's so strange how differently they viewed the world, isn't it? Because they thought a guy who'd overcome polio and risen to this height, even though he's in a wheelchair, was weak, which is so bizarre. But now if we have a governor, which we do, who's overcome an accident that made him paralyzed and continued his political career, we kind of see that as admirable. Whether I know you don't all like the governor, no one likes every political figure, but yeah, FDR, tough dude. He got polio when he was running for vice president with James Cox in 1920. It's typically transmitted by, it's a virus transmitted by mosquitoes. My father was had polio he must have gotten it in 42. Yeah, he was born in 41. He's just about to be 80. That's so crazy. Okay, Bayard Rustin, the book, I think the book is called Brother Outsider. But this dude, we'll talk about him later. He trains everybody in nonviolent resistance for the civil rights movement, but he's an openly gay Black man in the 40s and 50s. So they can't ever give him any credit. And he weirdly understands that. So it's just, what a weird time period. We can't acknowledge that the president has polio. They really did plan his press appearances where he's, sitting at a desk or leaning against something, or there's a podium with a drape on it. But everything was really staged during that time period for him to make sure that people did not see him with his braces or with his crutches or in a wheelchair. And there was even controversy when they built the FDR monument in DC about whether they should put him, have a statue or a bronze of him in the wheelchair. It's really, yeah, I think it's hard to get into the minds of people from this time period. I think you have to understand what their perspective is, or at least know what the perspective is without really embracing it or understanding it, because it's odd. All right, back to business. Although all of that was business, just strangely connected, I suppose. All right. So when FDR becomes president, and he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and people are kind of inspired by this, and he gives weekly addresses on the radio. They called them fireside chats. I don't know how we knew he was at the fireside. We did know sometimes because they did film of that, and they played that before movies. Movies are still trendy during this time period, too early for television. But instead of having the big inaugural balls and the parties and stuff that people tended to have, he said, nope, we got to get to work. And the first thing he does is something called a bank holiday, where they close the banks for a couple of weeks. He sends in bank examiners who are essentially accountants, and they go in and they say, you can continue to run your bank, your practices are good. You have to close down your bank because you don't have enough money, plus you gave out loans for stock. So they closed down the banks that needed to be closed. They strengthened the banks that are still running well. And then they passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which banned commercial banks from selling stock and created the FDIC. And I did put in a little chart here. I think it was in part because I got excited because I figured out how to insert pictures into notes. I know it's like low tech, but there it is. But this does have several of the important New Deal organizations or programs. So, and they're more than this, and your book certainly lists a lot of them. But if you know, again, CCC, FDIC, AAA, and NRA, I think you're in good shape. Plus, you have a general idea of what the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration do. And I assume you know what Social Security is because you have a job and they take money out for that, or you have grandparents, maybe, who get Social Security. If you're like me, maybe your little brother gets Social Security. He doesn't anymore, but my mom died early, so my little youngest brother got Social Security for, he got her Social Security until he was 18 or 21, I don't remember. His birthday was yesterday, he's 46, so it's been a long time. All right, so Hoover, I'm sorry, FDR, New Deal kind of jumps right in, and the first 100 days passes dozens of pieces of legislation to try to get the government back on track. So, two phases of the New Deal. We'll look at the first one. The first phase is more of a focus on relief, because remember, relief, recovery, and reform. Begins with Emergency Banking Act, creation of Securities and Exchange Commission, which creates the rules for stocks and trading and that sort of thing. And those things were pretty desperately needed after the stock market crash. People understood that if we didn't have a little more regulation, that perhaps we'd go a little crazy and crash the economy. The Civilian Conservation Corps, that sends young, it's men, 18 to 25 typically, urban area guys into state parks, national forests, that sort of stuff, to build ranger stations, do clearing, flood control projects, bridges, dams, that sort of stuff. And it's a good thing because these guys were kind of roaming around the city without jobs, so they might have been causing a little bit of trouble. At least that was the popular conception. And it gave them a little bit of money. They got paid, it was like $5 or $10 a month. I know you're going like, that's not much. And it wasn't much back then either. But they gave them a place to stay, they gave them food, and they gave them clothing, a uniform essentially. And they did calisthenics and work and that kind of stuff. So it's sort of like being in the military, but it's for public service. And every once in a while, you'll hear a politician say, like, we need to bring that back. And it's an interesting idea. There's certainly some countries that do stuff like this. But this program was popular because it gave the young guys something to do rather than roam around the cities and cause trouble. It made them feel useful because they were. It wasn't just a feeling. They were useful. They got a little bit of money. Plus, there was a larger amount of money that was sent home to their families. So they had the ability to help out their family. They had something to do. They were doing a public service. So almost everybody thinks this is a great idea. There's always that one guy's like, well, we shouldn't spend government money for that. If we really needed it, the private sector would take care of it. Get it? Yeah, except, you know, depression. So there you go. All right. NRA and AAA are declared unconstitutional. NRA, National Recovery Act or Administration, is going to create voluntary wage and price codes. So people would agree to a minimum wage, maximum production, that sort of stuff. And if your company agreed to that, you got a poster and you put that poster in your window, and people were more likely to shop at your store. It was the big blue eagle was the symbol of the NRA. I don't remember it, I promise, but I'm a history teacher, so I've read about it. The AAA did similar stuff. It paid some farmers to destroy livestock and crops the first year, but to not produce as much to cause farm income to increase. This kind of has a bad look because some people are literally starving to death during this time period. Now, they're not starving to death because there's not enough food. They're starving to death because they're not getting any of the food. So what ends up happening, even though it looks terrible that the food and the crops and the livestock are destroyed and the milk is poured out, that sort of stuff, you end up with a better distribution system as a result of the bad public look about this. All right, both of these are challenged in the court system, and the courts, which are a little more conservative than the government during this time period, say this is too much government interference in a private economy. So both of these are declared unconstitutional because they're seen as too much government interference in a private economy. In spite of all of these plans and programs, the unemployment rate remains at 20%. Now, certain farm states, it was about 50%. It had gone as high as 25% nationally, but down to 20% is not so much. The economy does show some improvement, and the expectation that the government should try to improve the economy has changed dramatically. It has. It's an expectation at this point rather than a prohibition. So we want the government to fix the economy when it crashes like this. However, this isn't really fixing it. So it makes people a little uncomfortable, and we decide as a country that we need to create more jobs. And you see that through the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration does similar stuff to the Public Works Administration, only if you study both of these, and you don't need to, but if you study both of these, I mean, you don't need to for this quiz. In life, you should. I think you should always study more history, but Public Works Administration is an early program, and it really does excellent work. I mean, they focus on the quality of the work, and they employ people who are really skilled craftsmen. WPA, the focus is different. It's like, let's just give as many people jobs as we possibly can so we can get them working, earning money, so they're spending money. So PWA is more focused on the product. WPA is more focused on the numbers of people employed. So people will sometimes refer to the WPA as we putter around. We putter around because not everybody was working hard. Like there's a really famous expose of a WPA program that paid one shift to dig a hole, and the next shift's job was to fill up the hole that the shift before it had dug. So it was sometimes pointless work. They also paid, people to visit old folks in old age homes, or to go to hospitals, and to help people grade papers, to write plays, that sort of stuff. So some people didn't see that as quite as important, but the goal of that was to improve the economy overall, not necessarily focus on the work. I also didn't mention, although it's coming up in the notes, that the NRA sets labor codes and wage codes that are different by race. So you could pay a white worker and a black worker differently, and that was set into the code. And that is not why it was declared unconstitutional. But the NAACP and other folks sometimes referred to this, and remember, terminology is different during the time period. They said that NRA stood for Negro Robbed Again. So there are definitely going to be legitimate complaints about race within the New Deal, and those are coming up as well. All right, WPA, Wagner Act is written to replace the NRA. Social Security, I assume that you have an idea what that is about. That's the goal of the Social Security program initially, was to get old people out of the workplace because they had the jobs and they wouldn't let them go. So, if you had an older experienced worker and maybe you're not paying him quite as much, hard to say, and he keeps doing his job, you're probably not going to fire him. But then the young guys with families need jobs during this time period. So part of the reason they created Social Security was get old guys out of the workforce. Because during this era, people didn't retire because you didn't save money for retirement. So Social Security, you pay in a certain percentage. I think you pay in 7%. The government or your employer really pays in 7%. Yeah, that's how it works. And then that money, you get a check when you turn whatever age. It was 62 during that time period. I think you can still do it at 62 now, but you can do 65 or 70, and then you get a monthly check now. And it was designed, the way it was designed, for every one person that got money, 5 people were paying in, and then all the extra money was supposed to be saved in an account so that when the larger population started taking out, there would be money in some savings account somewhere to help pay off that deficit. As you probably have guessed, we never saved the extra money, which is why Social Security doesn't exactly work the way it's designed. And of course, now people live longer, so they get more money. And a lot of times, if people like my dad, if you're my dad's age, he'll be 80 on his next birthday in less than a month. He has taken out more from Social Security than he's put in. I'm certain of it. And I'm happy, about that because, I like that dad's still alive. My mom's kind of the other end of the spectrum. She died really young, so she paid in and never really took out. So that balance is supposed to pay for and I guess my own family worked on that balance, didn't they, sadly? But that balance is supposed to pay for the extra folks, or, when you spend more than you take in. Then you're supposed to save that money, but no one ever has. Okay. Rural Electrification Agency. The middle of the country, the farming, ranching sector of the country, not everybody had electricity. 90% of the farms will, at the end of this, the New Deal, 80% were without at the beginning of the 1930s. So this is a major accomplishment of the New Deal, making sure the country folks have electricity. And also making sure, like I live in the fabulous city of Leander, Texas, and we have an electric cooperative, which is created during this era. So a lot of rural Texas gets their electricity during this time period. And it's also how Lyndon Johnson became famous because he really pushed for that. All right. Critics of the New Deal. Oh yeah, this is the class with the 3-minute warning. It's like, no, we still have time. Pausing, sorry. All right. Critics of the New Deal. The one guy I couldn't remember and the 2 guys I could. Dang, it's hard getting old. Huey Long. Dang, Huey Long was a weird dude. I would say he's one of the strangest politicians we've ever had. I know that's a judgment, and I told you not to make them. But you could read a book about Huey Long. They made a movie about him, which as a high school teacher, I could not show to my students because Huey Long did about everything you should never do as a politician or a grown person. He took bribes, he accepted bribes, he cheated on his wife, he drank too much, he was out of control. The man was out of control, but a really popular politician as well in Louisiana. And he really kind of set the tone for political corruption in his home state. So he served as governor of Louisiana. He'd served in a few offices before that, and then decided he might run for president. So he ran and got elected as senator from Louisiana, and then somehow gets assassinated in the process after he gets elected to the Senate. He runs FDR's campaign in the South in 1932, and in that meets a lot of people, and that's kind of when he starts deciding I could run for president too. And he starts something called the Share Our Wealth Society, and their concern was that the New Deal really didn't help poor people enough, that it really still just helped wealthier people more than poor people. He's not going to be the only one who feels that way. Actually, all 3 of these critics are going to feel that way, and they're all going to express them in different ways. Only one of them probably you'll look at and go like, no, that's acceptable. The other 2, you're going to go like, dang, are we still acting like that? But yes, we are. Okay, Huey Long says that what should happen is that everyone, he's like Andrew Yang, everyone should have a guaranteed annual income. And he says $2,500 a year, which is a good, solid kind of middle income for the Great Depression era. You're going, dang, they must have been broke. Yes, it's called the Great Depression. Plus, they didn't have a lot of inflation and stuff was cheap. But $2,500, that would have been a decent income during the era. Not great, but decent. And a guaranteed homestead, so a house, a place to live worth $5,000 a year. And that also would have been pretty nice for the time period. So this was really popular among poorer people. And the 30s is an era we're talking about stuff that sounds like socialism is completely acceptable because what we were doing clearly wasn't working well. So Huey Long said everybody should get $2,500 a year and $5,000 for a house. Where are you going to get that money? Rich people. Rich people. So you're going to take the money away from rich people and give it to poor people. What in the world did I just do there? Sorry. So you would confiscate annual incomes over $1 million and limit inheritance. So the thought during this era is if you're making $1 million during the Great Depression, you're a dog. I mean, you're taking advantage of people. You somehow scammed people out of their stocks. You robbed banks. I mean, not literally robbed banks. Although bank robbers were popular during this time period because people felt like, it's fine, the bank robbed us and one should rob them. It's a very strange time period. I guess every time period is for different reasons. But Huey Long said if you make over $1 million, well, you're taxed at 100%. So just confiscation and limited inheritance as well. And you take that extra money from the rich people and you give it to poor people so that everybody has a basic standard of living, a nice place to live, decent place to live, and a small income. So this was a popular idea. I think it's FDR's campaign referred to him as one of the most dangerous men in America, plans to run for president in 36, but gets assassinated, leaving a Senate committee hearing in 1935. Lots of speculation about why. He certainly had lots of enemies in Louisiana, and it seems like the person convicted of killing him was part of a business dealing in Louisiana. But when he was governor, he made his secretary, he had a friend who was an entertainer, a dancer, shall we say. She was a stripper. And he got an apartment for her and made her his secretary. And he lived with her while he was governor, and his family lived in the governor's mansion. He's a mess. He's super interesting, but he's a mess and then gets shot. All right. Dr. Francis Townsend, less of a mess. Sorry, squirrel on the back porch. On Dr. Francis Townsend, he's a doctor, shockingly enough, and he lives in California, and he's about 60-ish, and he gets cancer. And somehow he gets medical treatment that helps him recover from the cancer because still medical treatment during the time period is better, but I mean, they still don't know much about cancer during this era, and they're still developing good treatments. So his thought was after that, it's like, dang, notice how everyone I quote historically says, dang. He thought, well, dang, if I had not been a wealthy dude, fairly well-off dude, I could not have afforded this treatment, plus I'm old. And it's better for the rest of the country for old people to be taken care of a little bit because they're out of the workforce. So he says, we need to take care of the old folks and get them out of the workforce. So $200 a month for old people, $200 a month. They have to spend it, no saving, because you know how old people are. They're frugal. They like to save stuff. So you get $200 a month. You have to spend it, and you have to get out of the workforce. So once you get out of the workforce, we're going to pay you to stay home. And maybe also provide for medical care. Now, they're not going to do that right away. That comes later, but there's that discussion. What we end up with in Social Security is the monthly payment sort of thing. Later on, there'll be provisions for younger people who are unable to work. for people who need medical care who are younger. There'll be an older person, a retired person medical program that's added later. And I think that's about it. Oh, yeah, they were going to add unemployment benefits, but that ends up being a state thing. All right. Which is, as we know, sometimes supplemented by federal programs. And this gets passed, it turns into Social Security. This is pretty legitimate. Nobody goes like, that's a weird dude. That's just a guy who said, hey, this was my experience. People could benefit from it, and they probably did. All right, here we have a priest. Goodness. I'm not opposed to priests. One of my favorite, the guy that married my husband and me, a priest, super nice guy, one of my favorite people from that era of my life. But this guy would not have been one of my favorite people, I'm pretty sure. Father Charles Coughlin was a radio priest. He had a radio show that something like 25 million people listened to a day. So a bunch of people listen to this guy every day. And when Roosevelt ran for president, he's like, no, we have to vote for Roosevelt. It's Roosevelt or ruin. And, the country can't survive without him. He's going to save the country. Then when he became president, Coughlin didn't think that he did enough to help the average person, but instead he helped the bankers and the Wall Streeters too much, who happened to be, in Coughlin's opinion, disproportionately Jewish. So he's going to, have a few racial or ethnic issues of his own. So he's going to be anti-Semitic. He's going to talk about how Roosevelt helps the Jews too much. And this is in an era, Great Depression, where I know what's going on in Germany during this time period, but there's a reason that is kind of allowed to fester. And because internationally people are blaming the Great Depression on Jews, you see some of that sentiment within the United States as well. And you see it pretty pronounced, in a pronounced way, on the Coughlin radio show. Now, Coughlin's going to fall out of favor. People are not going to be as anti-Roosevelt as Coughlin is. However, people do still listen to the program, and being anti-Semitic is acceptable at the beginning of the 30s. As time goes along, not as much. And we'll talk more about that as we talk about World War II. Promise. All right. Okay. I've already mentioned that the AAA and NRA are declared unconstitutional. They think that's too much government interference in private business, in negotiating contracts, that kind of stuff. Then FDR says, you know what? I'm tired of you, Supreme Court. I'm going to change you. We're going to add more people to the Supreme Court. We're going to reorganize. They call it the Supreme Court Reform Plan. And the House and the Senate said, no, we are definitely not going to do this. What he wanted to do was force everyone out who was over the age of 70, or if they wouldn't retire, to add an additional justice to the Supreme Court, which could have taken the court from 9 to 16 members. And people referred to it as court packing. I know there was a discussion of that during the Biden run for president, and then people who know a little more about history went, oh, didn't FDR try that and it crashed and burned? It absolutely did. The reason it crashed and burned, FDR is enormously popular during this time period, but he announces this plan and he goes on the radio and, has the newsreels cover this. And he says, this is what I want to do. The Supreme Court is slowing down my reforms. They're living in the past. They don't understand the problems that we're facing. So if you think I should do this, I want you to call your congressman or send him a telegram or a letter and tell him that, you want this done. So people do call their congressman and send letters and telegrams, and they say no. There was a senator, his name is Frank Borah, B-O-R-A-H, from Idaho, and he says that this is more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have, which is a pretty good insult to your president there. But the concern was that FDR really had gotten everything he asked for from the Congress, and he had. You're not going to find very many presidents who have more success getting legislation passed than FDR. So, oops. So FDR essentially controls the legislative branch. He is the head of the executive branch, so he controls the executive branch like he's supposed to. Now he wants to control the judicial branch, and people say that's not a president, that's a king, or that's a dictator. And they really, put the brakes on that idea. They tell him he's kind of overstepped. However, he does get reelected. He gets elected in 32 and then in 36. All right. After he threatens this court reorganization, they don't declare any more of his stuff unconstitutional, and the 6 old guys retire, not all at once. And he does get to replace them before the end of his presidency, which encompasses more than 3 terms. He gets elected to 4 terms. He dies early in the 4th term. And of course, we haven't had anybody serve that long before or after because we pass an amendment. Yeah, okay. All right, some more stuff about the New Deal. Conservation becomes more important after the Dust Bowl. There are several books that are written that you could read. I know when I taught a summer class where almost all the kids went to Westwood, and their English teacher had them read some book about something about FDR being a conservationist and how the New Deal was really focused on conservation. And it was written by the New York Times environmental reporter, not a historian. And I told him, that's the issue. This guy doesn't have a historical background. He sees this from a modern perspective. FDR did do some things that helped with soil conservation. He didn't do it because he was a conservationist. He did it because it was good for the economy in the middle of the Great Depression. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that what he did was good for the environment. I'm just saying that's not why he did it. And that kind of matters historically. But anyway, we have Great Depression, and then we have the Dust Bowl because you have this enormous drought in the Midwest. So all the topsoil blows away, and then it's followed by a series of floods. So it is chaos. It's like, I don't know, 2012 or whatever year the world was supposed to end, or like 2020 felt, or like the snowpocalypse felt briefly, that sort of thing. But dang, the 30s were bad. I know when last year when we were in the middle of round 1 of our craziness, I had some students ask me, like, do you think this is the worst time in our history? I went, no. No, I really don't, because, we're not all standing at the dump begging for scraps. We're not all living in our cars. We're not selling apples on the street corner. We're not there just yet, but we're sure in a weird time, no doubt. But this is 10 years of mess, and it's economic mess, but it's also environmental mess. It's just a mess. So a lot of the New Deal agencies that do things that seem to be geared toward conservation are also to help repair the economy. So, and what we've noticed then, and I think we notice from time to time now, is that things that are good for the environment are often good for the economy. I know it's not always true. I don't want to have an argument about nuclear versus wind versus solar versus gas versus, I'm not equipped for that argument at all. But yeah, okay. So I'm just saying, in the 30s, soil conservation, damming up rivers, that kind of stuff also helped the economy, and it helped to conserve stuff. And it brought electricity to the country, which is useful. We like electricity. We've experienced briefly what it was like without it, so none of us want that. Other stuff that happens during the New Deal, women are more involved in politics. You see Eleanor Roosevelt, who refers to herself as her husband's legs. So she does a lot of traveling and speaking for him. She is a fascinating woman, and you could read a book, any book about her would be good, probably. But she is really much more focused on social issues. And if you're looking for somebody who's serious about civil rights, that's your woman right there. And she brings a lot of credibility on workers' rights, civil rights, helping people in poverty to the White House because of what she does as First Lady. So She'll push for labor and civil rights. She works with noted singer Marian Anderson, who's banned from singing at the, crud, what is the name of that event? It's the Daughters of the American Revolution annual convention. They invited her to sing at Constitution Hall, and I honestly don't know why they didn't know she was Black, but she's Black. And so she goes there and they go like, hey, this is a segregated place, you can't sing here. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who's not at the meeting but is a member, quits because of this and arranges for a concert, a free public concert for Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial, which is really fitting, of course. FDR appoints the first female cabinet secretary, Frances Perkins. Mary McLeod Bethune is going to be an education advisor to the National Youth Administration, which is part of the WPA. And she's the famed founder of, one of the founders of Bethune-Cookman College, which is a DC area educational school. And she's also African-American woman. You'll also see Black advisors to New Deal programs, even though the NRA does allow for the separate pay scales. So, but FDR, has a group of advisors that are sometimes referred to as the Black Cabinet. William Hastie, Robert Weaver, and Mary McLeod Bethune, and sometimes takes their advice, sometimes doesn't, but always consults with them. And what you will see as a result of New Deal programs dealing unfairly with African Americans, but including them in programs, which often, before this era, African Americans are just left out of programs, you will see urban Northern Black voters switch from voting for Republicans to Democrats. So if you're wondering when did that switch occur, that's when this switch occurs. You know that African Americans in the South just aren't voting because it's still dangerous. But African Americans in the North had continued to vote for Republicans because Party of Lincoln. At this point, the whole Party of Lincoln thing is worn off, and the New Deal is providing some assistance to African Americans, even though it's unfair in certain programs and leaves out a lot of domestic workers altogether in Social Security. But Eleanor Roosevelt is serious about civil rights, and FDR has African American advisors. So this is seen as an opening toward equality and inclusion, even though it's certainly not the full thing. But you see as a result, a switch of Black voters from the Republican Party to the Democrats in the North. And in the South, if you're Black, you're not voting because it's dangerous. All right, Indian New Deal, everything that happens to Native Americans is so positive. It ends the policy of assimilation, ends the Dawes Act, says you can do whatever you want with your reservation. However, this is in the middle of the Great Depression, and it also cuts off some of the funding to reservations. So it really, after changing the culture of reservations, it now says, you know what, you can do whatever you want on the reservation. So I don't know how helpful this is. Most people look at this and go like, no. And it does allow full citizenship for Native Americans, which is not exactly what everybody was excited about during this time period. It really doesn't change very much on the reservation because it continues to be, Native American reservations continue to be the poorest places in the United States. So yeah, this doesn't really help. It will help later. It doesn't help during this time period. Ending assimilation, ending the Dawes Act, restoring tribal autonomy, allowing for tribal government. After World War II, during the Civil Rights Movement, this will matter. At this time period, didn't make a bit of difference. So this is a save that for later moment, which we have a lot of those during this era and a little bit after. You know how we loved Mexicans in the 1920s because the economy was good? Not so much in the 30s. So they did immigration sweeps in major day labor sites. And if you could not prove that you were in the United States legally, they took you to a train station and you got a free trip to Mexico City. The free trip cost the United States about $12. So we, as a country, sent nearly 500,000 Mexicans or Mexican Americans out of the country. And if you're wondering, like, how could you not prove you were a citizen? Well, what documents do you have that prove that you're in the United States legally? You might have a driver's license, birth certificate if you're born in the United States, passport. They didn't have, except for birth certificates, they didn't have those things necessarily back then. So proving that you're in the country legally in that era is going to require some immigration papers, which people wouldn't carry like a file with them, or your birth certificate, and nobody carries that with you. So lots of people got deported who had never been anywhere but the United States. So this is problematic. And there's really not a push for workers' rights among agricultural workers during this time period, and you won't see that until Cesar Chavez in the 60s. Communism and socialism, both trendy during this time period. They both had active parties where people ran for office, sometimes got elected. You saw people get elected more at the state and local level. California had a socialist governor. I know some of you are going like, they still do. Texans. But it wasn't a bad thing to talk about or be a part of those groups during this time period because the economy was so bad. This is going to be this is one of those hold it for later moments as well. This is going to be problematic because after World War II, it is a problem to be communist or socialist. And those two things sometimes went together politically or on college campuses, that sort of thing. So later on, when there's this Red Scare, and it's like, have you ever been an associate or a member of a communist or socialist organization? If you were an adult in the 30s, you probably were. If you went to college in the 30s, you definitely were. So, darn it, sorry. So that's going to create problems for people later. It's not a problem in the 30s where people are pretty openly talking about these other systems because ours is a mess. So is everybody else's, by the way. But, you know, later on, that's going to come back to bite some people. And other stuff that's going on. Dorothea Lange is a New Deal photographer. So a lot of those migrant farmer pictures are from her. New Deal programs and popular film help promote, dignify, and celebrate the contributions of the common man. So it's an era that, you know, lifts up the working class people. You also have some super important African-American dudes who start to change society. One stays in history, written history, one gets written out. Charles Hamilton Houston is the mentor of Thurgood Marshall. He starts the law school at Howard University. He was a Harvard law graduate and wanted to start an African-American law school that would train lawyers specifically to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So this man is the reason for Brown versus Board of Education, and he's the reason. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened anyway, but I don't know how it wouldn't have happened in the same way without this person's lifelong dedication to, I mean, he made it his life's mission to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, created a law school, gave up what could have been a brilliant career and was a brilliant career, but I mean a career that earned him lots of money to instead do something that benefits everybody's life every day. So kudos, Charles Hamilton Houston, who we don't talk about in history often enough. Paul Robeson's kind of an interesting dude too. Paul Robeson was a professional football player. They didn't have too many of those back then, and they didn't make a lot of money back then, but he's a professional athlete. He's a lawyer. He got his degree at, oh, what's the really challenging? I know you're going to like us, which Ivy League isn't challenging? God, the one in New York. I hate it when I can't think of stuff, and it happens so often now that I'm old. I'm not even going to think of it, but he is a Ivy League educated lawyer as well. And he is also a performer. He's a really fine singer. He sings opera, and he's so talented and kind of in demand, that in the 20s and 30s, more in the 20s, because people didn't go to concerts as much in the 30s, when he would give a concert, he would tell people, I will not give a concert unless the audience is integrated. And, whether your facility is integrated or not, I'm not singing there unless it's integrated. And they would integrate the audience just for him. Yeah, no, so he was pretty powerful kind of dude. He's also the guy that played Othello in Shakespeare and really kind of is the first guy to get cast, first African-American to get cast as Othello. And then after that, nobody cast anybody but an African-American man as Othello, because you kind of harken back. Can I say that? Because I'm talking about you think back to Paul Robeson in that era. He ends up becoming more of a labor activist and then a declared communist. And then the federal government gets upset with him and they take his passport away and kind of ruin his career. And he gets kind of written out of history. And if you're looking, you're seeing some change here and you're seeing some hope, then the Scottsboro Boys, you can read a book about this. Dang, that'll be depressing. These are some guys who get arrested in the 30s. There's so many weird things going on in the 30s, but people are hopping trains in the 30s, especially South and Midwest, to go from one place to another to try to find work. And this is mostly agricultural areas. So they're jumping on trains illegally. And they called those guys hobos. That was the really specific term for them. There were also, because, poor women needed to make money or whatever during this time period, there were also hobo prostitutes. So people self-segregated, especially these guys, because it was in the South. And so there's the black car of hobos, there's the white car of hobos, and the hobo prostitutes, they were not, they did not segregate. So the hobo prostitutes and the African-American men get caught in Scottsboro, Alabama. So some police stop the train. They find the hobo prostitutes in the same car with the black men. There's like 9 of them in the car. And they ask the young women who are like 18 or 20, what's going on? And they don't say like, hey, we're hobo prostitutes, this is our job. They go like, these men raped us. And you know how this is going to turn out. So they get arrested for rape. They all get convicted, sentenced to death. I think the age range is like 13 to 45. It's a big range. In the middle of the trial, the women say, you know what? We're hobo prostitutes. We made this up because we didn't want to look bad. We don't want to see these guys get executed. So they end up with an appeal that takes 15 or 20 years, and a couple of them die in prison and some bad stuff happens. And it takes them a really long time to get out of prison, even though the hobo prostitute women said, we made this up. So there are lots of good books. It's not a good story, but there's lots of detailed books written about this that'll mostly depress you. But if you want to read more about depressing stuff, that would be Cornell. Dang it, that's the name of where Robeson graduated. Robeson's super smart dude and so talented. I mean, not just a natural athlete, a professional athlete, and then can sing opera and perform Shakespeare. Crud, what else? I don't know what else you can do. But that is a fascinating dude. If you don't know anything about him and you're interested, he'd be a fascinating guy to read about for your book review. All right, I know I'm a little bit before the 3-minute warning, which is sad, or it's good. I don't know which, but let's stop and see if you guys have any questions. I know I went through a lot of that stuff really fast, but are you feeling okay about the question? Let's look at the question again. Weekly question 1302. Lecture note. Here we go. Hopefully it's the right thing. Identify the changes in American politics and society brought about by the New Deal. Mention specific laws, philosophies, politicians in this discussion. For this, I just really want some details. So FDR needs to show up in here somewhere. You want to pick 2 or 3 New Deal agencies, and you've got to mention at some point in your answer that the American public has gone from thinking that it's not really the federal government's business to intervene in the economy, that should be taken care of by private industry, by charity, the same way that Hoover thought. Because honestly, most of the population thought the way Hoover did, except this Great Depression thing lasted so long that they eventually thought, no, this is the government's job to step in and intervene and fix things. Okay. All right. But mention some specific detail. That's typically, if I don't give you all the points you would like, it's usually because you haven't brought in some detail from the textbook or the lecture. I would always defer to the textbook, because it's easier to find the stuff. But the lecture notes hopefully will help, and you've got those chapter outlines too, but you've got the book for a reason, and it's a really good textbook. I know you're going like, nah, we hate textbooks, but this one's nicely written, it's concise, plus your author he's a solid historian, he's really good. I think he was from Cornell as well. All right, do you guys have questions? You're going like, no, just stop talking. I know you're saying that, I know you are. All right, let me double check the roll, I'll stop the recording.